Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back. This time I want to talk about covenant and mission. When you're reading through the biblical narrative, you begin with the creation stories of Israel, then we see the fall stories in Genesis 3 to 11, Genesis 12 to 50, talk about God's calling of a people to become his missional community that will reflect his character to, for, and among the nations. That's the call of Abraham, Sarah, and then the subsequent generations, and how God faithfully keeps his promises. And Israel grows from this couple, Abraham and Sarah, into this multitude that we find at the beginning of the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus tells the story of how God acts decisively through the events of the Exodus, particularly the Passover and the crossing of the Red Sea, to bring a people to himself, his nation Israel, to release them from the illegitimate service of Pharaoh, a tyrant, to the legitimate service of the King of all creation, the Creator God. And to forge this relationship on the other side of salvation, God invites God's people to make covenant. As Exodus 19:5 said, therefore, if you truly listen to my voice and keep my covenant, out of all nations you'll be my treasured possession. The whole earth is mine, or indeed the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God calls Israel through the vehicle of covenant to take on this new status as God's missional people to the whole world, as a people brought to himself. And so when we talk about covenant, this is the Hebrew word berit. And specifically, when we talk about covenant in this particular lecture, we're talking about the Sinai covenant. Now, what's important is to recognize that the Sinai covenant is the center of the Pentateuch. So from Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers 10:10, Israel's camped at Mount Sinai, and God communicates to God's people through Moses what it means to be God's missional people who live to embody God's character to, for, and in the nations. Now, we might also observe that the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll say a little bit about in a different lecture, restates the covenant. In a sense, that's what Deuteronomy means, the second law. This is Moses' retelling of Israel's story of deliverance and the law right before Moses' death and before Joshua leads God's people into the promised land. So take a look at this. Exodus 19 all the way through Numbers. So that's over half the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus, the first 10 chapters of Numbers, and then the book of Deuteronomy all deal with essentially the Sinai covenant. So what is covenant? Covenant is another example of an ancient Near Eastern form that God uses incarnationally to communicate truth to God's people. So you can find covenants in other ancient Near Eastern contexts. And so that we have examples of treaties that the Hittites, which would be with the persons that would have lived in modern day Turkey, but back in the biblical times, and also from the Assyrians, of different covenants that were made. And essentially a covenant in this context is a legal relationship, and the crystallization of a relationship between a great king and a people. And so Israel's covenant with the Lord has some things in common with these other ancient Near Eastern covenants. And one of the key things is in the scriptures, covenant is initiated by God, and it invites Israel, God's people, and instructs them and shapes them of what it looks like to live as God's people. And so life with God for Old Testament Israel is all about living relationally with God, with neighbor, with creation through this vehicle of covenant. And so, as I just said, the covenant has implication for Israel's life with God, life within the community, life with the wider world, including the nations, and ultimately with creation itself. And It's important to note, because sometimes the Old Testament is misread. We've been making an argument that God calls a people for the sake of the nations. But one of the reasons that God gives these laws, these prescriptions, these expectations for living, this ethic that God's people are supposed to live out, is for the sake of mission, but also this gives Israel a way to respond to God's grace. So it's always important that before we get to covenant, there's grace. And so we note that this major covenant in the Old Testament between God and Israel is forged through what? The deliverance, specifically the Exodus. And covenant then is God's offer of relationship to his people after they've received his grace. And the expected response of God's people then is faithfulness. So God acts on behalf of God's people to do what they couldn't have done for themselves, which was to release them from Egypt. And then God invites them into relationship with him through covenant. And so grace comes before law. In a sense, faithfulness or faithful obedience is a response to grace, not the cause of the relationship. And that's absolutely vital that we get that right. So covenant is not the means by which Israel gets a relationship with God. Covenant is the means or the vehicle through which Israel's faithfulness is to God's in response to God's grace. It's how Israel lives out that response to grace. So that's critical. Now, when we look at these biblical materials themselves, in a different lecture, I already talked about Exodus 19, 4 to 6. And in that text, God invites them to covenant in the broadest way. We have a historical prologue. This is what I've done for you. You saw what I did to the Egyptians, how I carried you on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. Now, if you will listen to my voice and keep my covenant, we have this offer of covenant. God's people will become a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. This is Israel's vocation. And Israel has a new identity. God's treasured possession. Okay, and these are all broad. So what does it mean to keep the covenant? Notice in Exodus 19, there's not a lot of specifics there. So this is very general. And I want you to note that the covenant starts off general. Keep my covenant. Listen to my voice. You'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You know, what's it mean to be God's missional people? What's it mean to be holy? What does it look like to live out this identity as God's treasured possession? Well, the subsequent laws help to fill this out. And let me show you a little bit how Exodus has arranged this part of the legal materials to get a sense of the kind of ethical reasoning, the kind of ethical prescriptions that the scriptures give us. And I'm going to do this by showing that these move from general to very specific. And so what happens next, after we have these general instructions, is God's people get the 10 Commandments. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. Now, in these verses, we have the 10 Commandments. We basically have two sets. And this is, again, very general here. The 10 Commandments take it down a level, a little bit more specific. And in the broadest brushstrokes, the 10 Commandments can be divided into two groups. The first commandments have to do with loving God. The second half of the 10 Commandments have to do with love of the neighbor. With one commandment that bridges these together, which is the Sabbath command, which combines both of these things. So notice we have another re-emphasis on the Sabbath here, right at the heart of the Ten Commandments. It's in Sabbath that love for God connects out to how we treat our neighbors. So everybody gets a Sabbath in ancient Israel, including animals, including non-Israelites, everyone. And so these are the Ten Commandments. And so as we move through the covenant, we move from a general call to obedience, of faithfulness, to specifics. This is what it looks like, the Ten Commandments, to even more specifics. So if we go down to the next block of teaching in Exodus, there's a group of laws called the Book of the Covenant. And this section essentially runs from the last verses of Exodus 20 all the way through chapter 23. And in the Book of the Covenant, we get very specific laws. Things like, don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. I don't know about you, that I've never been tempted to do that. Or what to do if your ox gores someone. Or how to rotate your crops. Or what rights slaves have. Now, it's interesting that the first two commands of the Book of the Covenant are laws about how to make an altar, love God, and then laws that govern slavery in ancient Israel, and specifically extending rights to the most marginalized people in society, which would have been slaves, and especially rights to female slaves, who are the most marginalized of all. And so the Book of the Covenant starts off with some really specific things. So this gives us a structure. So in other words, what's the response to grace? God offers covenant, and God's people respond to grace through faithfulness, through faithful obedience. Well, obedience to what? To God's call to be a missional community that reflects God's character to, for, and in the world. Well, what does it mean to reflect God's character? Again, the Ten Commandments give a broad ethic. Love God, love neighbor, and we have these 10 commandments. But you might note each of those 10 commandments is specific, but not that specific. So what's it mean to not take the Lord's name in vain? What's it mean not to kill? What's it mean to honor parents? What's it mean to keep Sabbath? Those things are broad and need fleshed out. This next block of laws, the Book of the Covenant, says that God's people then need to drill down and, given their context, lay out some specific ways that we can live into that faithfulness. Now, this is important for our ethical reflection today. When we get to the Book of the Covenant, some of those laws don't seem like they would be valid today. Like, for example, don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, or don't cut your hair to a certain length, or wear certain kinds of clothes, or rotate your crops. What if you live in a context or a culture where none of those things are even a temptation or even an issue for you? Well, let's take ox goring. Ox goring has to do with taking control of inadvertent accidents and inadvertent deaths that were caused by things in our possession. So, for example, our ox might not gore someone, but what would happen if you parked your car on a hill and you forgot to put the brake on and your car rolled down the hill and hit somebody? Again, it's an accident. You didn't mean to do it intentionally, but you still have a part to play. That's what some of those laws do. So there's principles in here that illustrate specific applications of the Ten Commandments. And so as we're looking to be missional leaders in our context today, you never want to reduce following Jesus to this, and that, a list. But at the same time, there's grounds to ask, what does it look like to be the best witness to Jesus in my context? How do I need to live out those 10 commandments today so that I can witness to others about the love of God, about the God who has delivered me? These are the questions that Exodus invites us to answer. As you have time, you also want to reflect on the way that Jesus sort of retells these laws, especially in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 48. Again, this is a taste of covenant and mission. We'll have some additional teaching on this block, but I want you to see that law is a response to grace. Obedience is a response to grace, not the cause of our relationship. and that God invites us to live as his holy people in our context today by living out these values of loving God and loving neighbor in concrete ways that reflect who God is to the people that live around us today. Thank you for listening. I'm Brian Russell, and I will see you next time.